So, what are your earliest recollections of being excited about history? Which I'm sure goes back to when you were but a lad.
But a lad in the 1950s with most like people in my age group point to Fess Parker as Davy Crockett. It was kind of an early stimulus towards history, and followed up with various Disney adventures of the likes of Jim Bridger and Daniel Boone, and later the Fess Parker series, Daniel Boone, and so on. It was
Johnny Tremaine.
Of course, John Wayne's The Alamo was huge in my youth.
So those were all jumping off points. And then my grandma, your mother, was pretty interested her whole life in our family history, which goes back to Boonesboro and the early settlements in Virginia and Pennsylvania, and as we later found out, I don't know if she ever got this far, but even up in New England, Massachusetts, and such. So
yeah, she was certainly a instigator in a lot of ways. Going back to my youth, I told the story the other night to your daughter about doing a skit of the Battle of the Alamo in front of the whole school, and I'm guessing that was 5th or 6th grade. Nevada School District, but we were at the township school in Milford, so it was just K through 6, and so not a huge assembly, but a pretty good sized one for a bunch of little kids out there and doing their thing. And your grandma had made us a silhouette, if you will, of the Alamo front of the chapel, which was the classic. Everybody knew that outline in those days because of the Fess Parker series on Disney. So yeah, that was quite an event. And I think as I grew up and got into the history, once I went to college, in even greater measure, it was your grandmother's stimulus helped me, but also as I got into it, it helped her pick up her game a little bit and get even more excited about going to these places that I was really beginning to explore, like the Boonesboro, and I was delighted when she found that Boonesboro connection to the family, and since then we found Harrodsburg connection and the Logan's Fort connection, and so it's all been kind of a waterfall from those early days.
yeah, stuff she would probably be delighted to know if she were with us still. You also have the Civil War, the Civil War 100-year anniversary.
Yeah, 1961. The television was lit up with Civil War stories, and I was grasping at anything I could find that sort of looked Civil War-ish, whether it was a gray coat or a cheap kepi from the state fair that were so poorly made that they fell apart in the first rain. But yeah, anything I could get my hands on. I actually found and I don't remember where I got it. I found a muzzle-loading toy flintlock, if you will, that shot a cork with a cap. The cap you could use the ramrod and push the cork down on the to the breech and put the cap in and shoot that cork out. And sad to say, that was my first trade, if you will, in the history hobby. And I traded that gun away to a kid named Gregory for what I do not even remember. But I must have really thought I had to have it, because that was the coolest toy gun that ever existed.
Yeah. Well, I also regret this trade. All right, so you get through high school. You're a accomplished athlete in high school. Went to college to be ultimately with the desire to coach athletics. But you sort of have a chance. You stumble upon a chance class. Tell us a little bit about.
Well, we had a kind of an odd situation at the University of Northern Iowa. There was a department that was started, and it was called Individual Studies. And basically it allowed any professor at the university to teach a class that he was near and dear to his heart. And there was a theater professor by the name of George Glenn. And he was a shooter, flintlocks and muzzle loaders in general. And he had started a club called the Turkey Foot Long Rifles. They're locally in Cedar Falls, Waterloo, Iowa. And he decided to offer a class called, see if I can remember this, a very long title, called Muzzleloading Firearms, Historic Perspective and Modern Sport. So all of that, so that first day of class, I remember going in, and here he has at least a half a dozen rifles and percussion pistols and a flintlock pistol or two, and there's much oohing and awing from myself and my classmates, and what he had done when he decided to put this class together, he had written to Dixie Gun Works and Navy Arms and Pedersoli and Uberti and all the world's muzzleloading gun manufacturers at the time, and asked them for help with this course. Could they provide at a reduced rate or even at a donation firearms for this class to shoot? And he was quite overwhelmed, I think, and amazed that they came forth with multiple guns. Dixie Gun Works, Navy Arms especially, Parker Hale, as I recall, provided a couple of guns, and I think Euro Arms of America was up and going by then. So yeah, Uberti and Pedersoli. I mean, he had brown besses, and he had long rifles, and he had percussion Civil War muskets, and so on. And Colt. I forgot about Colt. They provided a couple of their third generation percussion revolvers.
Oh wow!
For the class, so a lot of help.
Yeah. So you're pretty wide-eyed at this point. And really, I mean, you could say that course, would you say that course changed the course of your life?
It did. And George himself just kind of befriended me almost, and wide-eyed college student and professor that he was probably 10, 12 years my senior. So, but yeah, he eventually gave me a job in the Possibles Poke, which was a company that he and another school teacher, Cal Wolf, and another fellow, Mike Flaherty, started, and started selling muzzleloading kits and blankets and hats and knives and so on for the trade at the time, for the living history trade at the time. And so I got to know his family and was a common visitor to his house and so yeah, it went well beyond just being his student. We went to a lot of events together, and of course I was working for him for some of those, and later kind of went off on my own selling merchandise. So yeah, George was a pivotal
moment,
pivotal player in my history.
All right, so at this point, unbeknownst to you, so you start this class, but at this point, kind of pretty much unbeknownst to you, is there's this place where people can go to do this sort of thing in a little place called Friendship, Indiana. Your first trip was, do you remember which year?
Had to have been 70, summer of 74.
Summer of 74.
Yeah.
All right, so you go to Friendship. Describe if you can. It might be too painful. What was your first outfit?
Oh my. Well, previous to going to Friendship, I had gone down to J.C. Penney's and got their hat that they called the Marlboro hat, the Marlboro Man hat from the Marlboro cigarette commercials. And it was just a low crown, telescope crown, wide brimmed hat. So, it might have sort of fit into the 1830s, 40s. And, before I got to Friendship, the club, the Turkey Foot Long Rifles that I had joined because of George and so on, they were primarily a mountain man group and shot more percussion guns probably than flintlocks at that moment in time. And after getting my first flintlock from Pedersoli, it was just a horrible Italian flintlock. It cost $110. I remember that. And it would go off every now and then. The frizzen was, had to be constantly worked on, and the flints didn't last long, and it was just a poorly designed gun. So I began to have aspirations, and like I say, this all before going to Friendship the first time, just as part of being around George and Cal. So George and Cal, who were my employers at the Possible Spoke, and several other members of the Turkey Foot Long Rifles, Jim Acton comes to mind, Larry Folkerts, Dave Williams, they kind of introduced me to a little outfit out in Utah making guns called Green River Rifle Works. And Green River Rifle Works was the place to go to for a hawk and rifle at that moment in time. But they also made Lehman style trade rifles. And so I kind of financially, as a college student, it wasn't something I could just plunk down $500 or $600 to get a Hawkins. So I was looking at a Lehman in a semi-finished form, which I think was somewhere around $230. And so when I got it, I had to finish the barrel, brown the barrel and the lock and stain the wood and so on. It was pretty ready to go. Other than that, didn't have to do a lot of sanding or anything. So that was my first rifle that was really a rifle, and it was a tack driver. And another gun I eventually traded. But yeah, I wished I hadn't. It was a fine shooting gun and fit me well and so on. So that was the gun I went to the early shoots at the local club, and that's the gun I took to Friendship with me when Dave Williams and Larry Folkerts and George and I went down in a Triumph MG I believe it was, and a Austin Healey. So 2 of us in each car, and away we went. And getting Friendship, arriving and walking up into the primitive area was, I mean, kid in the candy store, big eyes, deer in the headlights, however you want to describe it. That's the way I was for the days that we were there. And so here I am, and I didn't have any sort of a shirt yet. So, not knowing anything, I bought this calico shirt, and it had these big, long collar. Looked more like a hippie shirt when you get right down to it, and probably was actually. And 4 or 5 different colors in the calico print, and so it was a pretty sad start to my career and living history.
Well, it got so that gets you started. You're at Friendship, and you're wide-eyed. Everything's in the coming years. How quickly did you decide to go from? Because at that time, everything was pretty much buckskinning. It was mountain man, buckskinning. Now, on the East Coast, there was a lot of people getting ready for the bicentennial. The BAR was forming, or had formed, I guess, by that point maybe. Was anybody really doing Revolutionary War that you knew of at that point?
The only flirting I had with early on was with the coming bicentennial. Went to Friendship in 74, went to work for George in 75. So we're just ahead of the bicentennial, and the Turkey Foot Long Rifles is putting together a group that will be dressed as Revolutionary War soldiers and will be available for parades during that big summer of celebration.
Right.
And so George again fixed me up with some of his old clothes as he was kind of upgrading. And so I had a rifleman's frock made that was probably part poly, part cotton. And I had George gave me a pair of his cotton overalls, military overalls. I had a very fine coonskin cap. So
very good. Everyone needs one.
So I was all set, and unfortunately there's a picture or two of that around the whole Turkey Foot parade group.
Yeah.
And there I am in that coonskin cap. But everybody was pretty bad. There was a couple of military uniforms that were polyester in that group, and because that's what we could do quick. And that's what the local costumer was already making, that kind of stuff out of polyester. So
yeah, it
was easy to go in there and say, yeah, I want one that fits me,
right,
like that.
So being around the mountain man stuff, that was kind of Friendship's bread and butter.
Mm-hmm.
But you kind of you've always been a little, I want to do something kind of different. I want to, when did you kind of make the decision, I think I'm going to do colonial stuff?
Well, there's a little bit of a backstory to getting there that involves my best friend Bob.
Now, when did you meet Bob?
Had to have been 75, I assume. I had gone to a shoot down somewhere around Des Moines, and Bob was there. And for whatever reason, sometimes 2 guys just hit it off, and Bob and I just hit it off. And we were both not dressed all that well at that particular shoot.
Yeah.
Because we were both still trying to do kind of the mountain man thing. And but as I got to know Bob, I found out that he was in a group called the Northwest Territorial Alliance, the NWTA, and was actually progressing into or had been in a really good French unit, the Royal DuPont. And I forget the name of the leader of that group, but he was well versed. He had researched beyond anybody that I'd ever heard of at that moment in time. He had gone to France to research this unit.
Oh wow!
And had some sort of a bloodline
connection to it,
as I recall. But anyway, they were top notch. They were the best of the best in the NWTA, and they were also members of the BAR. So that was my first, seeing Bob in his regimental. That was my first real look at anything, that was quality 18th century. So that was kind of my decision to go that route. And as I got to know Bob more and more, and there was a few guys when I went to Friendship in that first 2 or 3 years of the bicentennial, there were a few guys in that game already that I met. Hoppy Bush, for example. Holder's Militia was up and going. And they were doing things, here locally, and telling the stories. When I'd come in twice a year for Friendship, I'd hear all the stories about this, and I decided, I want to go there. I want to do that. And as time progressed, Bob was getting more and more into the Royal DuPont, but the guys that ran it, they could only muster 4 guys to do it, and he thought, I need something else to do that can maybe gather more guys and be a little more free flowing. So he and I talked, and we kind of decided on Morgan's Rifle Corps. And so Bob really did all the research, put all that together, you had to go to the NWTA and say, hey, we want to do this unit. Will you let us? And they signed off on it, and so we went forth and gathered a few guys. So in those next few years, we really started to go that way. So when I'm going to Friendship and seeing a few of these Holders Militia guys and so on, I'm kind of deciding this is really where I want to be day in and day out. I want just the mountain men. That happened 1,000, 1,500 miles to the west of me. This happened in kind of more in my backyard, so I want to do this.
Yeah. So you had you later then set up a wedge tent in a sea of teepees at Friendship, and
I did.
And so that was different. And now, so you did
actually first went with a wall tent that had walls about 1.5 feet high, and but also with a wedge tent. And I'm not sure how that sequence was for sure now that you mention it, but I had both of those there before really anybody had a wedge tent there.
Yeah.
Or a small wall tent. And there was this young man who was out of New Mexico at the time, I believe, and he came by one day and kind of stopped in his tracks and just started asking questions about this wedge tent or wall tent, whichever it was that year. And he really was really interested in this whole Eastern concept of the long hunter versus the mountain man, being out west, although he was a Michigan boy by birth, I believe, but he was out west teaching and And his name was Mark Baker, by the way. And so Hoppy and I, we sat with him for hours and hours during that particular shoot, just talking about the long hunter and proper shelters, and talking about the how we shouldn't have these Civil War Baker tents, and we shouldn't have these 1910 Whalen lean-tos, and of course teepees only for the West, not the East, and so on.
So already you were sort of thinking in terms of wanting to do things as best you could with what was available.
Yeah.
And kind of raise the status quo from what it had been. So you do that. You end up starting your own company. Kind of went under different names over time. We've I've grown up seeing the old catalogs and things, and grandma drew some of the illustrations for stuff that you sold in there, and so it was kind of a family affair. So you kind of went through a period where you kind of left the 18th century for a while. We were going out west quite a bit, doing kind of more of the, I guess you could say, cowboy. Went to Michael Martin Murphy's West Fest. How I remember it is in kind of the mid to late 90s, you kind of came back to it in a big way. Or maybe I was unaware because I was young of you staying involved in it, but we started to go east a lot more.
Yeah, by the time you were born, 1990, I was doing quite a bit of cowboy stuff. A lot of the 90s, I didn't do much 18th century. I still went to Fort Deschartres, which had at least a portion of the camp was 18th century, and I was going to Feast of the Hunter's Moon still early on. I think you were there as a small boy. So yeah, I was hanging on to certain events. I'd kind of quit going to Friendship for those years, and I had some other odd jobs that were keeping us alive during that time. But yeah, eventually I swung back. Probably in the late 90s, started really going back in earnest to the 18th century stuff. And
well, I seem to remember 98 maybe, 98 or 99, going to Deschartres for the first time that I remember with you, just the two of us.
Yeah, that would have had to have been one of those years, maybe 99.
And so that was kind of where my remembrance of all this stuff really starts. So now you've got kind of a 15-year period from you doing the Morgan's Rifle stuff with Bob. Now you're pretty much full-time merchant at events.
Right.
And now there's all this Mark Baker guy that was sort of the wide-eyed, buckskinner around the campfire. He has really made a big splash in reenacting. Yeah. And I think my understanding of it is, and hopefully, hopefully we'll interview him in all this process. But my understanding is that it really between, and we should talk about this because I think it's a pivotal moment. But between him and a little film called Last of the Mohicans, it seems like things really kind of exploded after that. Yeah. Was that your sense of it at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. And And it was you. I wish I had the chronology in front of me. What year did Last Mohicans come out?
93.
93
93 or 4.
93, 94.
Or it might have been 92.
Okay, so I think Mark was starting to do his articles by then. I'd really need to have to go back.
And this is in Muzzleloader Magazine.
Yeah, Muzzleloader Magazine for Orrin Skurlock.
Yeah.
I think he started, and then Bill, Orrin's son, took over, and so on.
And he put together a book at that time. I think it was maybe his thesis or whatever, but it was the Sons of the Trackless Forest.
Yeah, and that became popular, and people are still hoarding that book, and, and if they let go of it, it's a pretty penny.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitively, I think the art of David Wright, the articles of Mark Baker, really brought some focus to the long hunter that was kind of on the edges, and now it's all of a sudden center stage.
Yeah, it kind of became the impression.
Yeah.
We used to call them, the the Walnut Brigade. It's just like all these guys in walnut dyed hunting shirts and or what was considered a hunting shirt, I guess, in the 90s. And those guys just really came out of the woodwork.
Yeah, and there was a fever.
Yeah.
There was an urgency to
Yeah.
go that direction. And the rendezvous, which I was still attending in the early 90s and so on, late 80s, early 90s, the rendezvous were drifting away from the mountain man, where you weren't seeing 1,000 teepees at an eastern rendezvous. You were seeing, by that time maybe 100 teepees, and the rest were marquees and wedge tents and so on. So there was a definitive transformation of even the rendezvous, at least east of the Mississippi.
Yeah. So that's when the 90s is when the events like Manskers and Caesar's Creek and a lot of these early events that were really more focused on the Revolution period start cropping up.
Yeah.
And as a vendor, as a sutler, you were probably, heard about these. Oh, I need to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. I finally got to Manskers. Did Caesar's Creek several years. Again, tried to hang on to Feast the Hunter's Moon, Fort Ouatanon, Fort Deschart, and I'm trying to remember what year we eventually took the big step and went to Fort Niagara and
Ticonderoga.
Fort Ticonderoga.
Well, pretty early. I mean, it was probably 2001 or 2. Is my remembrance of it. But
yeah, that would probably be right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So now because of people like Mark and David Wright's art and all these things you mentioned, now the research has really started to become a focus of the hobby in an even bigger way during that period. People are really starting to get into the books. A lot more books are coming out. Things are really starting to progress. Was that exciting, kind of coming back into it, having been out of it for a while in a big way? Was all of that really exciting, and you were thinking like, man, I wish...
Yeah, I felt like I'd missed a lot. I felt like we were here on the precipice of really finding the solid information, that it was so difficult because it was, you had to physically go places. You had to use interlibrary loan to get information. You had to, microfiche.
Yeah.
Who knows what microfiche is to this generation? And so all of a sudden, there was stuff, like you say, there had been a boatload of books published in that kind of interim where I was playing cowboy, if you will, and doing other things in life, and all of a sudden I'm back, and there's a coming on of the internet and the instant ability to research and get good information in an evening.
Oh yeah. Well, there's books coming out like Beth Gilligan's articles on clothing and which my understanding was that was kind of her big forte, was the
And she was cutting edge at that time.
Yeah.
She was
Cut of Men's Clothes. Was that a book that came out?
Cut of Men's Clothes, Cut of Women's Clothes.
Yeah.
They were I think they were out earlier than Beth, but that was all we had, and all of those clothes were pretty high end.
Yeah.
So that book, Rural Pennsylvania Clothing, that came out by Shumway Publishing, seems like in the 80s.
Yeah.
Sometime that was a huge thing for the more common frontier types.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of it was a little late for what everybody was wanting to portray, it gave us an avenue to follow the trails.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it seems like that period of time, that the late 80s through the 90s was sort of a leap ahead. And then you talk about the internet. I remember I wasn't as much into this, but I remember getting in terms of age, I was young when this was all going on, but I remember getting On the Trail magazine that Jason Gatliff was publishing. I remember my brother, who's 10 years older than me, also getting that magazine, starting to get kitted out, and he was on historicaltrekking.com on the forums and talking, with all these guys that were doing this stuff too. And so there was a real, kind of, for the first time, a way to connect with people beyond your immediate group in a way that was not possible before. You could talk over the phone.
Right.
You could write a letter, but now you could instantly interact with people on a forum, and it stayed there so that you could reference it again.
Yeah.
And so that became a big, I think, was probably a big help for guys, that were trying to do this stuff. And so through this time, your focus is really through this time was doing the sutler thing, because you've kind of always wanted to kind of have that freedom, make your living with your hobby.
Yeah.
And did you? I kind of want to go a little bit further back though, when you were still, kind of the early 80s. What were the, if I can kind of tap into what were the hopes and dreams of people around the campfire, talking about the possibilities of the future? What were the goals of folks that were kind of wanting to do this stuff at maybe that higher level? Were people talking research around the campfire? Were people talking like, oh, I read this account, or I found this? What were some of those conversations, and who were some of those people that were really wanting to push it ahead, if you remember?
You're asking a lot of my memory. Well, in my inner circle, if you will, Bob Anderson, Hoppy Bush, Howard Bush, Wayne Milton, David Wright, of course, Kip Carter, Warner Moore, and Warner's son John was son David was in it too, but John jumped in a little deeper, I think, than David did, and is still coming out as a hunter. And so yeah, there's the hope. The hope was to find the next nugget, because they didn't come just. You didn't find 30 things in a night like you could, like you can now. You could find a thing or a couple of things in a 5-6 month period.
Yeah.
And just be ecstatic about it. You know, I remember when I was making doing some tack work on leather, and somebody found some square shank tacks. Well, square shank is appropriate. That was the tack of the 18th and early 19th century. And so when you found that, even though once you put that tack in the gun or in the leather or whatever, you didn't know it was square shanked.
Yeah.
But the guy that made it knew, and the guy that had it made for him knew, and
Right.
so on. So there started to become a desire for what Hoppy always referred to as right as rain.
Yeah.
We were looking for that right as rain stuff, and we, we would spend our nights around the campfire talking that kind of stuff. Others at the time were all about the social, the hobby of just being a fun time, just being a place to go and kick back and be away from work and being away from the rigors of daily life. And
well, and you saw a real difference between what I've heard about events at that time, and if you're talking about Rev War, like NWTA events or whatever, where at 5 o'clock when the public left, it was lawn chair time. It was get out the grills and the tiki torches and have a nice evening without all those clothes on that you wore all day. But then by the time we were coming, by the time you were coming back to it, and where I at my point of remembering, people stayed in their clothes all event 48 hours because I think the mindset had changed some.
Well, it was a shocker when I went to my first NWTA event with Bob, and that happened.
Now, that was a shocker for you at the time, even though that was commonplace for them.
Yeah.
So that shows the difference of mindset. You were there to... What were you there to
I was
do?
there to experience as much of the 18th century as I could, despite the surroundings.
Yeah.
Because often NWTA events were in some city park, so there was traffic noise, there was cars parked right there.
Right.
It was pretty hard to ignore the 20th century, but I wanted to try.
Right.
And Bob and I used to sit around and talk about what we really wanted to do was have a place out in the middle of nowhere, and we talked about building the fort and starting with the blockhouse, and being able to have an event there where it was 48 hours of the 18th century.
Yeah.
Not a discussion of
an immersion event.
Basically. An immersion event.
And you kind of got to taste that with your Old West group. They had a similar situation, but with the Old West. So you saw that happening, and you were like, well, this could be 18th century too.
Yeah.
And so, and now those types of events, happen more often than they used to. So that was the hope even then. It was sort of like, well, this is weird. Why are we spending all this time and all this effort to do this if we're just going to change out of our clothes at 5 o'clock and be in the 20th century? I thought the whole point was so that was a shock to you.
Yeah, getting out of their clothes was like, what? You got to be kidding me.
Now, did people see you and Bob kind of hanging out in your clothes and staying in the moment? Did they see that as odd?
It was kind of funny. Yeah, they did. You had to be, once your unit was put together, and our unit was just started out with just Bob and I. And we had some guys that we wanted to invite, but we wanted to get all our stuff in order first. And so we went to an event somewhere in Illinois, as I recall, and there was a inspector that had to go through our stuff piece by piece and look at our outfits and so on. And this, I don't remember his name, but he was really, really good. I mean, he was ahead of the game at that time. And yet he looked at Bob and I and went through all our stuff, and he says, "This is crazy. You guys should be inspecting me instead of the other way around." And so I give that credit mostly to Bob because he really wanted to do this. He'd learned it from the Royal DuPont thing to really do it as quality as he could, and he wanted to do the same here. And so that was them looking at us, I guess, and at least a few of them saw us as not the same.
Yeah.
Maybe going in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of, that dichotomy is still happening today.
Sure.
we're there's people that are content with the status quo, and then there's people that want to push the boundary further. And I certainly can say that all of these stories growing up is what made me want to do that myself and push further and try to do things to the best that the research allowed and the best that was available, that is available. So yeah, I definitely appreciate all of that. So did you feel like, Bob, for those that don't know, who Bob Anderson was, Bob eventually succumbed to cancer, I think in 95, 96.
98 or 9.
Oh, that late. Okay.
Yeah.
So did you see what was going on kind of after you kind of got back to the 18th century? Did you see all that was going on and how far things had come and thought, man, Bob would just be, this is exactly what we talked about?
Yeah. He would have loved Martin Station. He would have loved to have been a part of that from the get-go. Manskers would have been, and he did go to Manskers.
Oh, did
he? Yeah. He went actually to their winter thing, winter camp, maybe November. Because I remember, I'm sure David Wright was there, and Kip Carter was there when Bob went. And I wasn't able to join him, sorry to say, but
yeah. Well, that's good that he got a taste of what eventually would be kind of, legendary place, Manskers, for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
And then, I feel like Manskers, that crowd kind of, the crowd that was coming there was the eventual, a lot of the people that were there kind of made Martin's happen, that like
Yeah.
in terms of who was going to those events, the same people, and a lot of them went over and Martin Station got going. And do you remember talking about Bob would have loved Martin's, because Martin's in the early days was really, you could stand and you can still do this, you can stand at the fort, you can turn all the way around and not see a single modern thing.
Yeah.
And that's really what you and Bob were hoping for all those years ago before that. What was your first impression when you went to Martin's and you went down into the fort? What was that like? In contrast to other forts you'd been to, because obviously, Manskers is kind of, it's in town. I mean, it's kind of, you can kind of see the pavement, not far from the fort.
Yeah.
Boonesboro is obviously a telephone pole fort. I mean, we can say just what it is. I mean, it was built in a time that wasn't necessarily as concerned about the facts as it was sort of the legend,
Yeah.
It was kind of built on that Fess Parker model. So Martin's is really the first fort that's sort of out in the middle of this valley, all around. What was that like?
The single thing that Bob and I talked about, and that we always hoped for, we always looked for, was that single moment where you could say, whew, I just traveled back 250 years or 200 years or whatever, and that was a place where that could happen. In the midst of that battle there, in the midst of the dancing and festivities in the evening, I sat inside the gate one time with Chuck Edwards, and I just soaked it in. There was nothing out of place. The music was good and right. The dancing was like it very well might have been. You just hope and pray as a reenactor for that moment.
Yeah.
When you're there, as the Walter Cronkite used to say, you are there.
Yeah, I've had multiple moments like that at Martin's over the years, and you just feel like, there's nothing like it that I can compare it to when you have that feeling. It's sort of I guess you could say it is kind of the sort of the thing you chase, as if anybody is wondering like what's all this reenacting stuff about. Rather than, I think a lot of people would think like, oh well, this is it. What you guys are doing is just some sort of like live action role play, right? You're just kind of like LARPing out there, but it's really not that, because the point of living history is sort of to just kind of that, what Mark Baker called, experimental archaeology. You're kind of out there experimenting with the equipment to the, this is all the stuff they had to the best of our knowledge, and how do you use it? How do you wear it? How do you, does this work? Does that work? Oh, this is why they did this. You can discover things through, doing that. But then you're out there and you're put into a situation like at Martin's where, the whole scenario of that is, the forts were holding up in the fort because, the Indians are on the move, and we're holding up, and you really get to experience what that feels like. And then you have that moment in the midst of this broader experimental archaeology that you're supposed to be doing, and it can really send chills up your spine. And so yeah, it's interesting. You know, what's fun about this is that, you know, this was the desire, and, you know, it just to kind of see how long it took to get to that point, you know, where that became almost the norm, where before it was sort of, we'll go set up in a park in the middle of town, and we'll change out of our clothes at 5 o'clock, to now it's the norm to stay in the mode for 48 hours at an event, which is what you and Bob dreamed of, you know.
Yeah.
So, and I would say that probably, you know, all those things you talked about, you know, the David Wright art, the Mark Baker articles, the, you know, film Last of the Mohicans, The Patriot came out, you know, early in you know, 2001, 2001. And so, I don't know, it just seemed like a time period of fervor for the hobby and what could be possible.
Well, another another thing that was happening in those years, for example, the ability, the iron workers, knife makers, ability, axe makers, you know, in my early days in the hobby, to find an axe that was hand forged in the way they were in the 18th century was pretty few and far between.
Yeah.
There was only a handful of guys that were even trying it.
Like a new made.
Yeah.
Not old, you know. You could probably find a lot of old tools and old.
Yeah. But to find a new made axe.
Yeah.
That was made just like they were made back then.
Yeah.
Hoppy's friend Guthrie, Rick Guthrie, that worked at Williamsburg all those years. He said when he made something, he didn't want it to almost look like the original. He wanted it to look exactly like the original.
Yeah.
And so that kind of mentality was starting in those years to creep more and more in. And you know, where a tomahawk axe was commonly coming in from India or Pakistan, and they were arc welded, and you know, they were cleaned up pretty good, so you didn't see it real well. But even the ones made in the U.S. were made with some shortcuts, some modern shortcuts, including welding and so on. So there was only a handful of guys that were really making it in the same way.
Yeah.
That they made it then, and that increase has been dramatic.
Oh yeah.
Since we came back into the 18th century part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you can pretty much anything you want made can be made.
Yeah.
You know, but somebody out there is making it, or, you know, reproducing it. So.
Well, the thought of making a linen tent 40 years ago was, are you kidding?
Oh yeah.
I mean, even finding linen 40 years ago was challenging.
Right.
That wasn't just so expensive.
Yeah, and now, you know, I wouldn't say that they're commonplace, but they're definitely out there. Mm-hmm. You know, most of your units, most of your what you would call now, you know, a campaign unit, that does kind of better impressions. You know, if they do have a tent, and they're not just sleeping out of their knapsacks like, you know, they tend to do. If they do have a tent, it's linen, it's hand sewn.
Yeah.
And so that's just the way, you know, that's just the way that is now. So, it's really, that is a big difference. You know, things that would have been unthinkable
Yeah.
40 years ago are now, pretty, like I said, not commonplace, but definitely out there.
Yeah.
And readily, fairly readily available. If you want to order there are guys that you can now order a linen wedge tent from.
Yeah.
And in all reality, probably, you're going to pay more for it, but it's really not outrageous. Where I'm guessing back in the day, it probably would have just been, pretty outrageous. But yeah, I would say that has just exponentially grown over the years, and I remember that happening though during our, when I was young. I mean, there was starting to be a lot more artisans, a lot more craftsmen. It wasn't just sort of sutlers that sold a variety of things. It was people, this is what I make.
Yeah.
Here I am at this event set up making that thing, or
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's continued. So what would be, kind of as we wrap up here, what would be a couple of kind of your top moments in colonial reenacting that you could say this was a moment? It can be a I was taken back in time moment. It can be a this really changed my course. This really changed my perspective. This was a great moment with friends. What are some things that you look back on and say with fondness, I guess?
The first time I went to Fort Deschart, Walt Dubeld and Al Nielsen and I went down there together. And Walt, I believe, had been there previously. So he kind of was our tour guide, if you will, going down and setting up and so on. They had morning colors and evening colors every day. So I went inside just to observe the morning colors. And that gorgeous front gate on the fort, the French would assemble out in front, and they would come in with this very fancy fellow leading the way with his sword and his gorgeous outfit, if you will, uniform. But the French were followed by the 42nd. And the impressiveness of the 42nd to this Iowa farm boy was incredible, because they were aware of their dramatic entrance.
Oh yeah.
And David Hamilton and I forget the other fellow's name that came in side by side. And they're big guys.
Oh yeah.
They're tall, they're wide, they're big guys. And there was two more big guys right behind it. And as soon as they were through the gate, they were four abreast. And they got smaller as they went back.
Yeah.
Larry Chowning, my old friend, was at the back. He's 5'8", maybe, and these guys were 6'4". And then of course they had those bear hats on, but they just filled up that entrance, and it was one of those shivers up and down your spine, hair stand on end, all that.
Oh yeah.
Kind of a sense of
with bagpipes ablazing.
Yes. Yes. So that was such an impressive 18th century moment. That was, even though I was standing amongst tourists and whatnot, I was there moment,
Oh yeah.
and probably my first one in the 18th century. You know, again going to Martin Station, and that first time I ever sat inside the fort while the evening festivities and dancing were taking place. The first time at Fort Niagara, and Fort Ty. You know, I got to Fort Ty just as a visitor, probably in 85-ish, 86, somewhere in there, and was just taken aback by that, and then actually got to go be in that part of the event. There was extraordinary, and actually got to at least be a part of a couple of the battle reenactments as a part of Rogers Rangers. So that was a great moment in time, and why, I'm sure I'll think of 100 others after we're done, but
Those are pretty good.
Those jump right out.
Those are pretty good. Well, what do you? I guess the last question, and then we can retire. What do you hope the hobby will continue to do going into the future?
Well, my hope would be that there will be a continuing dialogue, if you will. That there will be a continuing effort to improve. You know, I recognize that guys my age, they've kind of played it this way for a long time, and they just really don't have the energy or the great desire to do it any different. They're enjoying the hobby as it's been for them, and they're satisfied with that, and but the younger ones coming up, I hope that they continue to push the envelope to be better, and as they continue to find new research that either definitively answers long-held questions, or at least supports long-held belief, or refutes those long-held beliefs. And I've seen a lot of that over these 35, 40 years of, oh, that's the way we thought it was, and well, now we realize that wasn't even close.
Yeah.
And what a great adventure. But I hope it doesn't get stagnant. I hope there's always at least a group that is pushing forward to make it better, to be better. But at the same time, don't throw out the old folks that are kind of led the way, because as somebody has said, had it not been for those folks, we wouldn't be where we're at. Even if they kind of sputtered out and didn't keep going, they at least set the stage for us to go further.
Yeah, I think everyone should always, no matter what you're doing, always remember who was there first, and the contributions that were made ahead of you, and the contributions that you can make now, building on top of what's already been done. And I think that's a perfect way to go.
And it's easy for your generation and younger to look back and say, well, why didn't they know this stuff? Well, this stuff just wasn't available.
Yeah.
It was like pulling teeth to learn some of the things that we learned in those days.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that's definitely you can, I mean, just knowing what you know about the advances in technology just in the last 15 years, I mean, it's been a progression of now you can access 50 million online archives and this and that and research papers and whatnot, but that's all relatively new.
Yep.
And definitely to our benefit, and hopefully we use it wisely and keep things moving forward. So, well, I guess that's that.
Okay.